The winters here in New York are long and dark. I've lived here almost my entire life, so I'm pretty much used to it. But last winter felt like it would never end. I think it had something to do with being stuck inside with a very energetic and inquisitive 3-year-old girl and a new baby boy. Oh, and by the way, this happened just before the whole lockdown, right in early March of last year. I mean, don't get me wrong. I love being able to stay home with my babies, but I would definitely say cabin fever had set in pretty bad. It was a pretty nice day, for it being early March. The snow at this point was all melted, the sun shining, so I decided to take them for a nice walk right around the neighborhood. I told my daughter to go and find her boots while I was busy putting the baby in the stroller, tucking all the blankets in. My daughter loved walks because she really enjoyed seeing all the animals and dogs in the neighborhood. She didn't care. Big dogs or small dogs. She loved them all the same. I knew she would love to have one, so I figured we'd get one in the next few years. Anyway, it was a great day for being March in upstate New York. And I remember thinking, as we're walking on the sidewalk past our neighbor's house, that maybe I was finally getting the hang of parenting 2 children. It had been a big adjustment, and I knew my daughter needed much more attention than I felt like I had been able to give her at the time. But being happy at the moment, walking along the sidewalk, and just enjoying being a toddler. There were a lot of dogs walking that day, and she was having so much fun. Since we were all enjoying our walk, I thought it would be a great day to go on a longer walk. I mean, the weather was definitely permitting it. So, I decided to turn onto the paved trail on the edge of a wooded preserve, next to our neighborhood. Abby was busy singing Baby Shark, and being such a nice day, I didn't even mind. Then, all of a sudden, she stops and asked, "Is that a cute puppy?" I didn't see anybody on the trail, so I thought she was asking for a puppy, and told her we would probably see one soon. But she wouldn't budge, and kept staring into the woods. Louder, she said it again. "Cute puppy, Mommy, cute puppy." But she didn't sound happy. She was kind of scared. I kept telling her I didn't see a puppy, but I saw she was pointing into the woods. I saw it. It was not a cute puppy. I don't know what it was, but it appeared to be taller than a person. My first thought was I was looking at a bear, but it was standing like a person would, on 2 legs. Or at least that's what I thought, since it was kind of partially blocked by the foliage in the trees, even though in the winter, it's kind of non-existent. But there was enough branches and brush to kind of block any discernible shape. It started walking slowly toward us, and I held my finger to my lips, telling Abby to remain quiet. I'm surprised she listened. Now, my heart was pounding into my chest, and I was trying to plan our escape, when this animal walked into a clearing, and all of us saw it. It appeared to be a dog or wolf of some kind. At least, that's what the head was. But the body appeared to be this giant muscular person, covered in dark fur. I was questioning everything that I thought I knew. Was I looking at a werewolf? I just knew we had to get out of there, and quickly. Just then, out of nowhere, a deer comes running past us, and right past the beast, which immediately took off after the deer, heading away from us. Somebody might as well have ran by with a slab of steak on a stick. I grabbed my daughter's hand, told her to run. As we're running, we heard something like a scream, but it wasn't a human scream. At least, I don't think so. I don't know if it was the deer or this animal. My daughter asked what that was, and asked if it was a big doggy. I told her I didn't know, but everything would be fine. We just had to keep moving. And after that, the rest of the walk is kind of a blur. I barely remember getting us out of there. I tried so hard not to let Abby see how terrified and shaken I was after the encounter, with what I later learned could only have been something called a Dogman, which apparently there's quite a bit of them here in New York. I know nothing of these animals, and have only barely heard about them. I didn't even think they were a thing, but I guess apparently werewolves are suddenly now real? But when I asked these questions, I found out that these are not werewolves, but something else entirely. Some sort of two-legged walking dog, I guess. Anyway, this was almost a year ago now, and I'm fortunate that this experience didn't alter or disturb my daughter in any way that was permanent. But I'll tell you what though, it's a walk I will never forget. Thank you for hearing my story. In the fall of 1997, a girl had gone missing in my town. At the time, I was only 24, and my brother was a volunteer firefighter. He actually asked me to be part of one of the search parties the town had organized to get together and look for her. We spent days sweeping parks, abandoned lots, and the forests all around town. But as the days passed, the search parties began to narrow and get smaller. But I stayed with it, as did most of the people on the crew. We did secondary sweeps of the deeper forested areas, knowing that she would be harder to find the further out we went. With fewer of us out there, we broke off alone, on solo, but were usually still within yelling distance of one another. And we also had communication, aka walkie-talkies. One afternoon, about an hour or so before dusk, I spotted some weird marks on the ground. I was keeping an eye out for footprints, either child-sized ones or adult ones. That mean someone had brought her there. But these tracks were not shoe prints. They appeared to be barefoot. A huge footprint, with marks at the toes. Almost kind of like claw marks. But the shape was decidedly human, and there were only 2 prints, meaning it had to have been a person, or something else that walks upright. I mean, what else are we talking here? A gorilla? It couldn't have been an animal. So I called out to another crew member to take a look, and unfortunately, he was just as confused as I. Since we couldn't rule out that they were human, although they were weird, we did follow them. We followed them for what felt like miles, and it was beginning to get late and getting dark. But we did not want to lose the marks overnight, just in case it rained and they washed away or became indiscernible. We radioed for help, got one another person, an older guy. He seemed even less convinced about the footprints, but due to the nature of the missing case, agreed to follow them with us. As dusk came, the footprints got harder and harder to see, even with flashlights, and they were pretty high quality, mind you. We had to slow down and search carefully now. It was starting to seem less and less likely that someone had carried this girl far, but we were not ready to give up on the only lead we'd had so far. While we were stumbling around in the near dark, we started hearing sounds. Someone or something walking, stepping on twigs and dry leaves right around us. We called out, thinking that it might be another member of the search party. Nobody answered, so we swung our flashlights around, but still no one saw. The sounds continued, and I thought about the marks. Whoever left them might still be here with us, and it could be someone dangerous, considering the circumstances. The 3 of us stood back to back, looking into the forest. I had a small knife with me, and the flashlights were heavy duty, but weren't exactly any kind of weapon. Finally, we saw a shape approaching. It was just a tall shadow, walking towards us, slowly and awkwardly. We called out some more, asking him to identify himself, but he did not answer. As he got closer, I noticed that his shape was all wrong. He was wider than a human, the head being way too big, and he was slightly hunched over, his legs bent backwards, almost like a dog, although he appeared to be walking upright. We pointed all three of our flashlights at what we thought was a person, or maybe a misidentified animal. We could tell pretty quickly that this was not a man, at least any man that we had ever seen. That it almost had certainly made the tracks. Whatever this animal was, it had almost certainly made the tracks that we were currently following, and it appeared to be on 2 feet, bipedally, and was also vaguely human-shaped. But the rest of it appeared to be canid of some kind, especially in the chest and head. It appeared to be covered in long canid fur, a little more stringy than a wolf, but still very much like a long-haired dog. Its face was pointed, and ears very much sticking straight up. Its mouth was open, and we could visibly see saliva dripping from its overabundance of unnatural sharp teeth. It slowly stepped toward us, never taking its gaze off any of us. In fact, it was so intent, it stared straight into our eyes. The eyes were glowing faintly in the dark. We backed away as it advanced, moving back the way we came. It never changed its pace, neither did we. At least until this thing let out this monstrous howl, and then lunged. That's when we took off running. It took us a long time to get out to the woods. It was dark, we were panicked, so we managed to get lost. Occasionally, one of us would think that we saw this animal, and we'd start running again. It was chaos for that short time. We eventually made our way out, called the police. While we waited for them to arrive, we planned what we would tell them. All we could agree on was that it was some kind of half man or half dog or something. I don't know. One of us mentioned the idea of a werewolf, but it just seemed too ridiculous. And as far as mentioning it to the cops, wouldn't even waste our time. So we had ultimately just planned on saying that we had just followed these human footprints deep into the forest, and that we believed the person whoever took this little girl had made them. The police arrived and agreed to send a team in the following day, following our instructions to where we had lost the footprints. An entire days of search later, they returned, saying they did not find anything suspicious. They didn't say anything about the unknown animal we had witnessed the previous day, nearly trying to attack us. Turns out, 2 days later, the girl that had been missing was found, alive. She had somehow wandered off and got lost. It was a miracle that she was never eaten or attacked by this thing, especially when I think about what it is that we saw. It was so Blair Witch Project-esque. We made some general reports to animal control about maybe a wild dog in those woods, but as you can imagine, that request wasn't taken very seriously. But to this day, I can't explain what I saw in there. But I have never gone back in there. I mean, I'm not really a woodsy guy, so I would have no reason to. But just about under no circumstance will I ever go back in there. So, to give context, I didn't believe in wendigos or anything supernatural like that growing up, due to my upbringing as a Jehovah's Witness. I didn't scare easily, save especially when it came to dark, until that one morning. I was about 10 when my parents wanted me to visit my uncle for a couple of weeks in the winter and help him around his property. I, of course, complied, just moments after the promise of otter pops and chilling out with my uncle. My uncle's house was wedged between Madras and Warm Springs, and he had a couple of neighbors just within earshot of the property. So it wasn't entirely isolated. But I hadn't realized that I'd get stuck with the chore of throwing a couple of flakes of hay to his horses every morning after the first couple days. And so by morning, it was more or less a bit before 6, and it was very dark. So, the 5th morning, I came out to fling hay over the fences, and I get spooked by the sound of geese flopping about. I had to take a quick pause and gather myself as I continued to distribute the hay. Weirdly enough, I noticed the horses had not come any closer to munch the hay that they usually whine for. They just stayed huddled together in the shed, making it impossible to tell which is the other. Then, to my delayed horror, I noticed one of the 2 horses came galloping over from the other side of the area to prey upon the hay that usually they consume with much glee. I looked back at the shed as the horses began moving together. It didn't feel any way natural to see 2 horses moving so forcibly like that. It was a good enough reason to book it out of there already, but me and my dense skull had already decided to throw the last 2 flakes before booking it back to the house. Then, the frozen morning dew being crushed inside the pen had already caught my gaze, and I felt like my heart had stopped. I had witnessed the 2 horses huddled together, twisting in such a way that they were sprinting as one thing towards me, and before I knew it, my legs were now making a full sprint to the back door of the house. I kept hearing the sounds of not broncos galloping, but the thumping of hands or feet, crushing the frozen cheatgrass. I'd like to know what you guys think, and what this could have been. I mean, this may have been something I've never dealt with before. It has been a decade now since, and I still hear that noise in my nightmares. What should I do? I was 7 years old, which is not too long ago. I had a habit of talking to myself while walking around outside. In fact, I could spend all day outside, or even stay outside all night, without ever getting scared or anything, until this one day. I was walking outside doing my everyday thing. The entire property was covered in woodlands, surrounding the house and the long driveway that leads to the road. Nothing but giant woods, actually. And the woods were so big, you can go to the top of the driveway, look at the overview of the woods, just extending miles and miles out. When I was going to the side of the house to the door that leads underneath the house, I heard walking and crying. So naturally, I walked over to where it was, shining my flashlight at the noises, and I wish I would have immediately ran, hearing those noises, then looking at the thing. What I saw was easily the most terrifying thing I've ever seen in my life. The thing was a bluish pale with a greenish white glowing eyes. It was as tall as a doorway, the skin stretching so tight over the thing that I could see the veins and bones. The hands were the size of a dinner plate, and the fingers very bony and long. Its face was behind a bush, so I couldn't see it well, but I could make out a little. It began moving its head around, trying to look at me. The way it moved around unsettled me so bad, so I just stood still in fear, trying to process what was looking at me. It stopped moving, and it crouched down like a frog, getting ready to hop. The face of this thing is what unsettled me the most. Its face had an angry, really angry expression, and the teeth were sharp. It had more teeth than I could honestly count. Long, sharp teeth, big, bulging, glowing eyes. angry expression, and no nose. Just two small holes. It was the perfect combination of a face of a creature you should never mess with. I screamed so loud it was kind of scared by me, but still seemed interested in what I thought was it wanting to disembowel me. I ran to the back porch, which was pretty far away, but I was determined. I ran faster than normal, and I was already out of breath. But having a very sore cramp is way more better than being torn apart. I ran onto the back porch, busting through the door, slamming it shut. The first thing I did was lock it, run to my room, cry, and cower under my bed, staying up all night, and never going outside again at night after that. Look, I've never seen the thing ever again, but I can't go outside alone in the day. But at night, no one unless the entire military guarding the perimeter would make me do that. My parents did not buy my story. But my brother? Well, he's crazy when a subject comes to Wendigos, and he believes me. Honestly, I don't know if it's a crawler or a Wendigo or what. Please, help me. Help me understand what I saw. To preface, I was born and raised in Arizona, and I'm very mindful and fascinated by the general Navajo culture. I do not speak on Skinwalkers often, out of respect for the very real fear and activity that's highly cultivated by discussing them. Anyway, on to the story. I live in an apartment with my roommate. We're not religious. Actually, we're both ex-Catholic, but are very into spirituality in the spiritual realm. She's been struggling with rejecting toxic and parasitic people in her life, and was actually in a deep meditation before basically falling asleep, reflecting on how to expel intrusive thoughts caused by hateful people. She sees two entities while in this meditation. Went to sleep, wakes up around midnight in a sleep paralysis to see a black entity in her room staring at her. Now, on my side of the apartment, I didn't know what was going on, or any of this was even happening. So I fell asleep around 11:30, slipped into a lucid dream paralysis-like state, which is not really common for me. My room looked exactly the same as it did when I fell asleep. In the dream, my roommate opens the door, sits on my bed to try and soothe me during this paralysis. But as she was talking, I shortly realized her voice sounded wrong. It was all choppy and robotic. It was either an entity posing as her, or it had taken total control of her body. Then this thing tried to enter me by pretending to touch my face in some false soothing manner. I could feel its fingers trying to force their way into my mouth. I was inclined to bite, but I knew I was in danger, and I was scared because it was still her body. I mean, I didn't want to hurt her hand. As soon as I felt it start to get into my mouth, I was literally shot out of the dream and instantaneously wide awake. We think the pervasive thoughts she's been experiencing for so long from toxic situations was actually cast out of her and looking for a new host. But I wouldn't accept it because of how in tune I am with her and just a general growth in confidence and awareness. Look, I know this seems crazy, but this could have been some other type of entity. I'm not sure. After much reflecting, I felt like what everybody else describes as skinwalkers, but it did seem slightly less sinister. I don't know. Almost a weak attempt at imitating my roommate to take some kind of life force from me. Shapeshifter, skinwalker, entity. I don't know. We're reeling a bit, but honestly, Any thoughts are much appreciated. I'm 37, 36 at the time of this encounter, and have always been interested in things like the paranormal. I've actually had a couple of encounters and experiences that don't quite fit into the shapeshifter Skinwalker bubble, so I'll talk about those elsewhere. I would just like to backtrack for a moment and emphasize that, quote-unquote, interested in the paranormal does not mean an outright believer. I mean, I'm certainly open to it, but more often than not, I'll enter a situation with a very agnostic attitude and instantly develop one of skepticism once I begin assessing and getting a chance to evaluate everything. That being said, I do love a good mystery, and don't think for a moment that people who believe in such things are lying or possibly stupid. We all have our reasons for believing what we do. I tried sending this through voicemail to Monsters Among Us a while ago, but I don't think it ever got aired. Anyway, enough backstory. Let's get to the story. I was working 1.5 jobs in 2019. The half job was an on-call assistant private investigator, and my main full-time job was a security guard. We mainly did patrols for apartments and a small handful of residential contracts. This particular event took place at 19th Avenue and Camelback, which, if you're from Phoenix, you know is a pretty shady part of town. The apartments I patrolled were just south of there. They were predominantly low-income tenants, half of whom were refugees all over the globe. The complex was well known in the area for things like theft, violence, break-ins, drug dealing, gangbanging, and so on. I liked patrolling it because I felt like I was helping people who genuinely needed it, and the vast majority of them were very grateful that I was there. I got to know many of them very well, and so we would often talk and shoot the breeze before I got any chance to start making my rounds again. One of the people I would talk to was an older native guy, who I won't name for obvious reasons. Often, he was on his balcony, getting drunk and high, things which we were supposed to report, but whatever. As long as you weren't causing any trouble or making too much disturbance, I'm not saying anything. I would usually say hi. He would say hi to me, and I arrived on post. We'd talk for a while, then I'd begin my shift. You know, I never had any real issues with the guy. He just liked listening to music, having a couple beers, and maybe having a blunt or two. Seemed like a pretty genuinely nice guy. He even had a tattoo on his chest of some Kachina doll, though I have no idea if they play into this encounter or not. Anyway, in the summer of 2019, I was doing my rounds, and right around 8:30 p.m., I hear him chanting loudly in his native language. I went to see if he was okay, as he never did this before. When I get there, he was inside, so I kept doing my patrol until I heard it again not long after. I went back inside, or back to the side of the complex where he was, and saw him, his pregnant fiancée, and his son, whom I had never met before, all coming down the stairs. He looked at me and said, "Hey, follow me." When I was walking behind them, I saw what appeared to be a giant-looking knife in the son's hand. But when we get to the parking lot, I could see it was just a very large feather, and his father had 2 smaller ones, maybe from a juvenile eagle. When we entered the parking lot, I saw a native woman standing there who I had kicked out earlier for being too loud and yelling at a guy who was the roommate of the native tenant. I'd seen him before and knew he lived there, but didn't know he was his roommate. You know, I don't remember what they were arguing about, at least this time. But she had her 2 sons with her, a 10-year-old boy and a 6-month-old baby in a stroller. They were going back and forth with each other, and the father and son began taking the feathers, rubbing them on the children's faces, while whispering in their language. The mother begins flipping out. "Don't you put that on my babies! You sicko! Get away!" And so on. I was about to step in and tell them that they need to stop, when they both stood up and said in a very guilty voice, "We aren't doing anything to hurt the baby. That's why I even brought the security guard, just to make sure everything is okay." And she replied, "He doesn't even know what's going on." Truer words could have never been spoken. So she then says this: "If you guys aren't doing anything wrong, then do it on your pregnant fiance's belly." The dad just says, "Okay," turns to his son to whisper something in his ear. Now the kid's turn to flip out, and he yells, "You're still evil. I'm half Christian, and I'm not doing this evil stuff," etc., etc., and takes off running. The dad and his fiancée yelled at him to come back. Then he takes off after him. I'm stuck there, trying to get the lady with the kids to leave, now for their own safety. Then I ran off looking for the dad and son. I didn't find them, so just assumed they had left the property, and therefore weren't my problem any longer. Not long after, I see a fresh blood trail and vomit on the sidewalk, and a knife nearby it. Walked back to the native guy's balcony, where I can now see him getting bandaged up by his fiancée, due to having a huge gash on his forehead. I called the cops. I hated doing that now, but this had turned serious. They came, I explained everything that had happened, and they knocked on his door, and of course, there was no answer. They explained to me there was nothing they could do, since this appeared to be a family issue, and the dad was attacked, didn't want to talk to them, which, it makes sense, I suppose from their point of view. So no charges were ever filed. The next day, I speak with the manager about the incident. He tells me, "Oh, you mean Mike?" Obviously not his real name. "Man, I've been keeping an eye on him. He moved here after he got let out of prison for manslaughter." If any of you are familiar with the process of becoming a Skinwalker, you would know that one of the big steps to take in order to become one involves the murder of a family member. I only saw the guy a few times afterwards, and we never done of the incident again. But it was always in the back of my mind whenever I saw him. For the record, I don't personally think people can turn into coyotes or wield magical powers, and no disrespect intended to anyone. However, I do think that some people think they are capable of such things. Anyway, if someone who is more knowledgeable about these things has any ideas, I would love to hear them, particularly about the feathers and the tattoos. I knew a native guy years ago who had a specific tattoo put on him by a family member in case he ever got into prison, so he could not be recruited by the Warrior Society, which is a native prison gang. Think their version of the Aryan Brotherhood, and always wondered if they had any hand in the whole Skinwalker thing in the Southwest. I was relaxing in my bedroom, playing some video games, when I hear this howling outside my window. This is fairly average for me because I live in a bit of a secluded area that's near a city but far enough away that wild animals are around me. But what made this time different was the howling seemed a bit distorted, if that makes sense. It just sounded weird. That was enough for me to look out my window. At first, I see nothing, but when I turn on the lights outside, automatically turned on if I press a button on my phone, I see a wolf or coyote standing on its back legs with its fronts in the air. I watched for a few moments while this thing kind of walked around a bit and howled some more. At this point, I freak out, lock all the doors in the house, and called my mom and dad, who were out of the house that particular night, shopping or something. So they immediately come home, and I explain what had happened. They call the police and report a potential burglar or stalker. When they hang up, I try and convince them that that's what it actually was. But of course, in the end, they don't end up believing me. So my question for you is, what do skinwalkers generally look like? Secondly, how can I prevent a skinwalker coming near or to my house again? And third, what do I do if I see one of these things again? This took place a few years ago. I was in my late teens, driving home at around 10 p.m. This was a typical shift for me, and I was not too tired. I know what I saw. I lived somewhat out in the country, far enough to be on septic, close enough to be on the county's water system. I mean, it wasn't irregular to see wildlife at night, like elk, barn cats, deer, even occasionally dogs. I'd been living here for a few years at this point, and during this time, one particular neighbor had this really bad habit of his dog running free on the side of the road. So, I love animals. I would always pull over, call the number on his collar, and get him back to his rightful owner. So, anyway, I'm driving home, nearly 1 block and 3 turns from my house. I see this figure out of the corner of my eye. It looks like a medium-sized dog. I roll down my window, turn my music down, and start calling out to it as I would a dog. "Hey, come here, sweetie. Come here, baby." It seemed very shy, as it refused to look at me, and its body language was very timid. I kept trying to speak sweetly to it, let it know that I was in no way a threat. It looked a little skinny, seemed to have short gray hair. I really wanted to see if I could help it, maybe find its owner, or get it somewhere safe and fed. It finally responds to my sweet talking, turns to face me, and my stomach drops. This is gonna sound crazy, but it had a human face. The best way I could describe it is like a Teletubby. You know, I really wish there was another way to describe it, for the sake of my credibility. But it had no distinctive features, and its head was still shaped like a dog. It did not make any faces, any noises, and it did not speak either. I was so surprised that I screamed and I sped off. I was so scared too because my house had a gate that I had to open, and I didn't know if it was following me or anything. I didn't look back, and it didn't appear to chase after me as I was speeding off. I feel bad about it to this day, and I wish I didn't react the way I did, but I didn't know if I was in danger. Seeing something like that, something that you just can't explain, I don't know. I really can't stress enough how it did not make any facial expressions, noises, or speech, anything. I was the one going out of my way to bug it, and I was bluntly rude to it. I haven't seen it since. I wish I could change how I reacted, and I really do wonder about that all the time. So I did some internet scavenging afterwards. I haven't been able to find any experiences like it, which now makes me feel even more nuts. Maybe it was something slightly different than a skinwalker, but this is the closest lore of it that I know of. If you've had any similar experiences, I have a ton of questions. Circa 2012, I was in combat training with the Marine Corps in Southern California on fire watch one night, roughly 2 a.m., with 2 Navajo guys. We were on the subject of skinwalkers, telling stories that our grandparents or others had told us. we were all generally feeling a little creeped out, just from the atmosphere and the stories, when we hear the most distorted coyote howl any of us have ever heard. And what we could guess was about 50 yards away. It was like someone was slowing down a vinyl recording of a coyote howl with their finger. We all froze, and were now stark white. We stared at each other for a bit, sweating. We finally pointed our flashlights in the direction of this distorted howl, and we all saw what looked like a coyote head sitting on a fence post. So here we are, just staring at it, in the shaky lights, absolutely silent. The head was pointed in our direction. Its eyes were open, but they didn't shine. They were just black. Finally, I say, maybe somebody found a dead coyote and put its head on the post. Sometimes, farmers will hang a dead coyote on a fence to keep other coyotes away. Our training was taking place on a large open cattle field, after all. And right after I say that, the head turns slightly to the left and moves off the post. From behind the post, this coyote walks out on its hind legs, its jaw and tongue dangling like they were broken, and then just walks off into the darkness, beyond the reach of our flashlights. We all immediately poop bricks, and we book it out of there, where everybody was sleeping, and of course proceeded to not sleep properly for the rest of our time out there. I mean, how could you? I'm telling you now, though, all three of us saw it, and all three of us know exactly what we saw. Moral of the story: speak about it, and they appear. I'm going to try my best to keep not only my identity anonymous, but even some of the parks I worked at unknown and undisclosed for the time being. I don't want my information connected to my past work history at all, just for my own protection. Not to mention, any previous colleagues could easily trace this back to me if I opened up on too much information. I worked for a park ranger service for well over 20 years, mainly all around Colorado State. I've been a part of and worked on numerous search and rescue missions, and have just done my normal rounds as a patrol officer. You bet that I've had my hands full in things you probably wouldn't even believe. Nothing like seeing a portal, or demons coming out. Nothing that absurd. But I've seen things that I can't explain with my own eyes, or the circumstances that I found myself in. Today, I would like to share with you a few of the strange things that has happened to me while working as a ranger. The very first one that comes to mind is also the first in the chronological order of my history. Again, for the sake of anonymity, I won't tell you exactly what river, but it's one of the many main rivers that runs throughout the entirety of the state of Colorado. We had a hiker go missing. Search and rescue turned up unsuccessful in its attempt to rescue this hiker. In fact, no remains, nothing were ever found, and the whereabouts of that hiker remained unknown. About 7 or 8 months later, since this occurred in January of that year, now going to July or August, and people were reporting seeing in the evening and nighttime a miscellaneous random cloaked figure. This person or thing was seen to wear all black in like a hooded cloak, walking around the park. Nobody stopped them and asked them who they were or where they were going. I guess they were probably too scared. But I myself saw the same figure multiple times, sometimes during the evening and sometimes at night. On numerous occasions, I tried stopping them, but they always seemed to vanish out of thin air, like I was seeing some sort of hallucination or possibly an apparition that looked like a full physical being. Now, here is where the story I just told you and this black hooded figure tie in together. One day, I was doing my rounds along this river when I see this figure walking out in a part of the path that we're not supposed to go, at least for tourists. Us rangers can. Determined to get a hold of whoever this cloaked figure was that had been somehow managing to elude every ranger there, I pursued him or her for about a good mile or so, keeping about 200 yards behind him or her, watching them as they seamlessly crossed this very rocky and hard terrain, almost like it was nothing. I followed this figure all the way, for maybe 2 miles at most, to a large clearing in the woods, where I found a tattered backpack that had been severely weathered and worn out. Well, turns out, the backpack actually belonged to the girl who had gone missing back in January of that same year. A follow-up investigation was sparked because of the newfound evidence, and her remains were actually found probably within 50 feet of that clearing. There was nothing but bones left, and she had actually been buried about 3 feet under the ground. No signs of her ever actually being buried, though. It's as if she had just been buried in the ground forever ago, and just completely dissipated. Being in the ground for that long, you would see traces of other things, like clothing, or jewelry, or anything else. But she was so badly decomposed, being just bones, and even the bones were in such old condition. It was as if she had been buried there for hundreds of years. A DNA analysis proved that it was indeed her, and further refinement with dental records also proved it was her. But nobody could explain why she was buried naked, or why she was so badly decomposed in such a short amount of time. Which means that whoever this hooded or cloaked figure was a prime suspect. And maybe it was intentional, maybe it wasn't. But this figure led us to this girl's remains. Police and all of us rangers from then on out were on high alert, thinking this person, whoever they were, walking around the parks were very dangerous. And what's even worse, this cloaked figure was being seen all around the state, not just in this park, which means that it could have been a cult, more than one person. But by that fall, a month or two later, all sightings of this mysterious cloaked person completely vanished, ceasing completely. Nobody's entirely sure if that figure had anything to do with the murder or the remains of that woman, but after that, we never saw them again, have no explanation for why or what they were. Many, including I, believe it was a person or a group of individuals responsible, a part of a massive cult here in the state of Colorado, also responsible for many sacrifices and murders, which we also believe is responsible for many missing persons. Which brings me to my next story. I remember the year. It was 1999, the summertime, and a man who was an avid fisherman and outdoorsman. His first name was Bill. I won't say his last name. He had gone missing under mysterious circumstances. His family was camping in one of the larger state parks in the state. One morning, the family woke up to find him not in his tent, his sleeping bag vacant. Everything he owned and had was still right where he had left it when he had fallen asleep. But he was missing. No trace of him anywhere. Even though there was an outhouse nearby and a bathroom, nothing. Nobody had reported seeing him. No traces, no footprints, nothing. When there was a search and rescue put on, dogs could only trace his smell about a half a mile into the woods, and then abruptly stopped at a large incline, about a 300-foot incline to be exact. Then, about a month or so goes by, and I hear from a fellow colleague that they had found a severed hand, knifed into a tree. So imagine a hand, severed, and then a knife placed through the palm, right into the tree. Once found, DNA tests were ran to see and determine who it could have belonged to. Everything pointed back to Bill, which again reopened yet another investigation. But why? Why would his severed hand be 7 miles north of where he disappeared? It made no sense. The person who found it was a lone hiker on a solo 50-mile hike journey through the Colorado state. And after thorough investigation of the surrounding areas, of not only where Bill disappeared, but where his severed hand was found, there was no evidence, no blood trail, even no scent trail. The dogs refused to go past the 100-foot perimeter of where his hand was, and they acted very strange, which is very weird. Even the knife that was found going through his hand into the tree was also tested, but no DNA would come up. Only Bill's DNA. It's yet another gruesome mystery that still remains unsolved. Oh, and another horrifying detail that I did not want to forget. While this specific investigation was going on, and I've only heard this a handful of times, this being one of those cases, keep in mind that when researching and when out on the field, it was daylight savings time. Sundown wasn't till around 7:38 p.m. at the time. But somehow, when they had found the hand and were thoroughly searching the surrounding areas, it got dark at about 4:30, 5 p.m. Only in that area though, because when radioing away to a completely different area, maybe 50 miles, the sun was still out. Something unexplainable was causing darkness, or the illusion that the sun had gone down. I understand if you read this and probably think I'm crazy, but I'm telling you first-hand accounts from not only me, but my colleagues as well. Strange, unknown experiences nobody can really explain off. The only thing we can do is just be completely baffled by what we've all gone through. Which leads me to my third and final experience that I will share with you today. This was right around 2007. I was down in the southern portion of the state. Again, I won't name the nearest town, but it's not a small town. And I was doing a casual patrol when I began to smell a very strange smell. It was kind of like a cross between wet dog, death, and a very thick, musty odor. My first thought was that a pack of wolves or something had killed a large elk, but the odor just kept growing in intensity. Then, I began to feel like something was watching me just beyond the trees. Feeling immediate danger, I grabbed hold of my pistol and began scouring the area just in case I might be under attack. God only knows if there's somebody that hides in the woods that will try to attack you. That was my first thought. Then, as I'm looking, I see this large brown figure standing about 2 trees in, just beyond the tree line. And from where I'm at, I'm gonna guess this figure was easily 8 or 9 feet tall, massive, covered in hair, and poking its head out beside the tree to look at me. For about 2 seconds, I saw this animal or creature's face, and it was really, really ugly. Let me just stop and say that I've heard multiple accounts of Bigfoot. I've read stories, I've heard people talk and show me casts. I've even seen the Patterson film. I feel I have a general idea of what they should look like. But this thing that I saw looked nothing like a hominid, or any sort of Neanderthal or advanced ape. Its face was almost protruding outward, and had a short, flat snout. Think of like a bulldog. And had large, nasty, gangly teeth sticking all out of its mouth. It almost kind of reminded me of some kind of troll or orc from like maybe the Lord of the Rings, except covered in thick brown hair all over its body. The eyes were a dull red, very dark, very set in its skull, and it had massive long claws at the end of each of its fingers as it grabbed a hold of the tree and watched me. It didn't look like it was angry or aggressive, just very intently watching me, as if it was waiting for me to see what I would do or how I'd react. As I'm looking at whatever animal this is, or whatever it could possibly be, I keep hold of my pistol, because, frankly, I have no idea whatever this thing is capable of, and I was not taking any chances getting ready to find out. After maybe a few more seconds of intently watching me, it pulls itself back behind the tree, completely concealing itself from all visibility. I keep my pistol at the ready, just in case whatever unknown animal this is decides to act on instinct and attack. Maybe 20 seconds goes by, but when you're in that continuous state of fear and paranoia and anxiety, 20 seconds seems like 5 minutes. Everything kind of just went back to being calm again. Noises returned around me. The smell kind of dissipated, including the carcass death smell, and I never saw the figure move anywhere. I did investigate, and I never saw it behind the tree, even when I looked. So I have no idea where it could have gone. There's no secret trap door. There's nowhere that it could have gone without me seeing it. So where exactly did it go from being behind the tree? It's like it just vanished. But I'll tell you what, after that little stint in that portion of the trail, I more than had my fill for the day. And so I got out of there, even though the sounds had returned, and the smells had dissipated, and the feeling of being hunted was gone. I heavily opted not to take that same route again the following day. I want you to keep in mind that these are only a handful of experiences that I've dealt with personally. I've had more. I've had colleagues who've dealt with stuff that are far more terrifying, far more strange, and far worse. Maybe sometime I'll talk to them and have them tell their own stories. But for now, I'll just leave you with these. I hope you find them entertaining. My goal is that whoever you read this to, or if you do decide to come forward with this and go public, share this information with your own audience. My hope is that it will help others go public with their own experiences, instead of fearing ridicule, being paranoid by what others may think or judge. It's best to get the truth out there and let people know that there's things going on, the things even as a ranger I couldn't explain, that I was told to not talk about or write off completely. I've kept so much of this information suppressed for such a long time. You probably wouldn't even believe the sleepless nights that I've gone through, the many bottles of liquor I've drank down just to process, to keep this information subsided. But maybe this information getting out there will benefit for the better. I sure hope it does. As always, let's keep in touch. I would love to share more encounters with you. I got a bunch, ranging from all different varieties. Just let me know. If your audience enjoys these, well, I'll be more inclined to share more. Back in May of 2015, me and a few close buddies of mine went on a backpacking venture off in the mountains for 4 or 5 days. But it wasn't until the 3rd and 4th day that we would have our strange sighting of this person who seemed to be obsessed with following us around. Enough of background info. Let me jump right to the story. The first 3 days of camping and hiking went great. We would set up tent, fish, cook food, hike, rinse and repeat. And at nighttime, once we had established a firm camping spot, we would eat a lot of food, fish, drink beer, pass out. Also making sure to keep well hydrated. It was a blast. Then, on the 3rd day, we saw what appeared to be another hiker, although he was dressed in very strange clothing, kind of looking like he came out of Jumanji or a Peter Pan movie. And unlike us, he also was not walking on any trail, but kind of off on a ridge in the distance, close enough that we could see him, see what he was wearing, and see that his behavior was strange, but far enough away we couldn't exactly see his face. As that day progressed, later into the late afternoon, we found a really nice camping spot right next to a small lake or a larger pond. Great trout, by the way. But halfway through fishing, we noticed we see that same guy again, who must have followed us at least 4 miles up trail. And now, he was standing on the opposite end of this small lake or large pond, just beyond the trees, keeping watch of us. My friend pointed him out to me, and I think we were all a little unnerved by the whole thing. So I'm like, you know what? I'm gonna go talk to this guy. Give him the benefit of a doubt. Maybe he needs help. My friends thoroughly advised me not to, because we don't know who he is. We're out here in the middle of the woods all by ourselves. I mean, there's no telling if he had a weapon or anything. So I ignore that, and my gut instinct. So I go and try and talk to this guy. He sees me coming around the lake, coming towards him, and when I get maybe 100 feet away from him, he just takes off running in the opposite direction. So I just stop, and I'm like, alright, whatever. I'm not dealing with this. So I just turn right back around, walk back towards camp, and tell my friends everything that happened. They kind of just blow it off. I mean, some crazy man in the woods is following us around, right? What could possibly go wrong? Well, the sun begins to go down, we start a fire, have some fish that night, a couple of beers and water, and we kind of forget all about this weird dude watching us in the woods. As we're getting ready to go to bed that night, I have to go take a leak in the woods. So I step just out of the range of the fire, just to go and relieve myself, when I could hear something or somebody crunching around in the leaves, not far away. Immediately, my attention is sprung up around me, and my eyes, at this point, have kind of somewhat adjusted to the darkness, since I wasn't in the light of the fire any longer. And I swear, maybe 4 trees away, I saw what appeared to be a person crouching behind a tree, watching me. Then I immediately remembered this guy from earlier, and I put all the dots together in my head. So I yelled out, "Hey, I know you're there. I could see you." And what does he do? He takes off running again. Assuming that was who this was, I just hear them turn around and start bolting off, running. So without peeing, I walk back to camp, which is maybe 20 feet, and my friends are all alerted because they obviously had heard me yelling, asking me what was going on. I tell them what I saw, and that I believe it was the guy from earlier. Now we're all kind of up in arms and kind of paranoid, not really sure what to expect next. After all, we didn't exactly know who this person was, or really what they were capable of. We had to have our guard up at all times to honestly be safe. We all just stayed up, huddled around the fire, and it kind of killed any good mood or vibe we had going on for the evening. I was beginning to think that he was going to attack our campsite, and we were all going to be murdered by the morning. And finally, about 1 or 2 in the morning comes, and we all decide that it's time to turn in. But I just could not shake the feeling that this creep out there was waiting for the right opportunity for us to fall asleep. So I climb into my sleeping bag, lay it on my head, and I try my best to attempt to sleep. My few friends are a little bit more inebriated than I am. Actually, at that point, I had no alcohol in my system at all, so I lie there awake for easily what felt like a whole other hour. My other 3 friends were snoring. I'm trying to fall asleep, but I just can't. I'm too paranoid, thinking that this guy is going to come and get us. I don't know. Then I hear somebody approaching our campsite, and now I'm fully alerted. I start listening intently, and I could hear footsteps approaching my friend's tent. Now I'm fully alert, ready for action, and stupid me did not bring a single weapon with us, except a dainty little pocket knife. I don't know what I was thinking, and when I look back, I'll always kick myself for this. I could hear whoever it was outside my friend's tent was feeling around. I could hear their hands running across the fabric of the tent, almost like they were looking for a zipper, which they probably were. The fire was just coals and embers now, so it should be pretty dark out there. I was in my own tent, by myself, and I had no idea what to do, how to alert their attention. Then, I hear the zipper start to slowly go down on their tent. I hear it go down just about all the way, and then silence. So I'm sitting there in my sleeping bag, realizing I have no weapon. And what if this guy comes to my tent and does the same thing? I'm completely defenseless. God forbid he has a gun or a knife. Or maybe this is some deliverance thing, where I'm gonna get raped. So I'm laying there, expecting to hear something, waiting for something to happen, but nothing ever does. And now I believe hours go by, and eventually, it starts getting light outside, and then the sun is coming up. As soon as there's even a glimpse of light, I jump outside my tent, enough that I can somewhat see around me. I quickly run over to my friend's tent, jump in there, and wake him up pretty violently, telling him, "Dude, what happened?" And of course, he's sound asleep. So I startled him, and he's like, "Why are you waking me up? What's going on?" I told him, "Dude, your tent zipper was wide open. Did you see what happened last night?" He looks completely confused and stunned as to what I'm even talking about. I told him I was lying in my tent last night after everybody else had fallen asleep, and I heard footsteps from the woods come up to your tent, open the zipper slowly, and, well, I told him I didn't hear anything after that. But as I'm explaining this to him, the color drains from his face because he too saw that guy the day before, so we only knew it could be one person. But he also says that some point early in the night, or the morning, he thinks he woke up and saw this figure standing just outside of his tent, but he convinced himself he was dreaming, so he fell back asleep. Now he knew that that was a reality. We both jump up out of his tent, completely creeped out, wake up our other friends, and kind of scour our campsite, looking for any evidence of anything he might have done. Nothing. No food or supplies were taken, or even rifled through. There's no tracks or evidence he was even here. Weird. Why would somebody come here? What was their purpose? And honestly, there's no telling how long he was standing there with the tent door open, watching my friends sleep. Just thinking about it makes me shudder. After that, we hiked back, and got back pretty quickly. It did take the whole day, but we never saw that strange man again, and I hope we never do. I've been homeless a lot. I've lived in some distant family's land, where they have old cabins up on stilts, due to the local woods flooding heavily sometimes. Illinois is weird. Anyway, I spent a good amount of time in this old cabin. Wood stove, porch swing hanging from the ceiling that I would use as a bed. Overall, it was an okay place, and it wasn't too far of a drive to town for food. You just had to tolerate the half-mile walk to your car. One day, I am out walking around the woods in a smallish clearing in the path. I see easily a good 50 to 60 dead geese. Every single one of them is mangled in horrific ways. Necks ripped off the body. Bodies splayed out over old timbers and fence posts. Feathers are everywhere. Bones sticking out of the dirt. It looked just like a straight-up goose genocide. The ground was dry, though. There was a whole lot of dust. I saw no prints. There was no other evidence of anything being in the area, aside from what can only assume was some sort of strange breed of exploding goose. I also found a torn open old backpack and a great deal of candy wrappers strewn about it, all way too moldy to identify anything about it. So I decided to turn back and see if I could grab a camera when I start hearing this god-awful shrieking noise, as if it were coming from every possible nook and cranny within a 30-foot radius. I took off pretty fast when that started. To this day, my best guess is some sort of massive commune of foxes. It really is the only rational solution I could come to. Still, scared me to death. Oh man, I hope someone reads this, 'cause holy cow. I enjoy primitive camping, and me and my wife go out sometimes just by ourselves. We usually bring the dog, spend a couple of nights. This time, though, we invited some friends for drinking shenanigans. Anyway, on the first day, we hear a vehicle coming down the road. Not odd. There are maybe 10 more sites on this several miles of road. It's a dirt road, with nothing there but these primitive sites. One way in, one way out. What is odd, though, is that the vehicle was a meatpacking truck, or maybe ice cream truck. It was old, really old, and all the lettering and signage was faded, or had been taken off at some point. It was this fading beige and decrepit. None of us actually made out the person driving it, but there were no tags or plates on the back at all. So, we all get creeped out, but collectively kind of decide it wasn't as weird as we thought, and get back to enjoying our night. Flash forward to the next morning. My mom calls. She's panicking, freaking out. Apparently, some hikers were abducted near us. There are several girls at our site, including my wife, and she is convinced it was them. No names were released. I wanted to know how near, so I pulled up my GPS and an article I found about it with their last known locations. It was roughly about a half-mile away from where we were. I legit don't remember what happened after that, but I'm scouring the news from those years. It's a hard-to-find article. I want to say they found one of the girls tied to a tree. Apparently, there are quite a lot of people abducted and murdered on and near the parkway finding this. Pretty sure they never found the guy, but I guess it is the perfect place for any serial killer to act out his fantasies. Not exactly terrifying, but definitely a creepy find. So, this past summer, in 2017, I was working on a project monitoring amphibian larvae in vernal pools. Many of them were in the middle of a wide expanse of state land, largely unpatrolled. Technically, with no public access, but plenty of old logging roads and ATV trails that people don't usually use for poetic strolls at sunrise, or through nature, or even bird watching. I stumbled onto a lot of illegal dumps with weird things. Sofas, construction equipment, hundreds of chew cans, baby clothes, you name it. Not to mention plenty of abandoned camps and hangouts for people to shoot up heroin. Plenty of disposed of paraphernalia, after all. But, without a doubt, the creepiest thing I stumbled across, while all alone for about 5 miles from a paved road, following only game trails, was an upright, gently used baby stroller. There were toys in the storage areas, and a blanket still in the main area. I even have a picture of it on my old phone. I just stood there, staring at it. Like any moment, something from the hills have eyes was about to step out from the woods. I have no explanation for what or why this was out here, and I'm sure you don't either. Before I start, let me just say this. I know it sounds cliche, but a girl on a lonely road has a breakdown, gets out of the car and sees something weird or spooky, right? But I can't help that this happened to me. All I have is this experience now, and I have to live with it. Look, cliches don't leave paws or huge jagged scratch marks down the side of your car either. Cliches don't do that. Unknown animals or monsters do. In fact, 2 years ago, I was on my way to my parents' house from my boyfriend's place. These days, we live together downtown, but at the time, our parents lived in neighboring towns in the hills above Boulder, Colorado. We'd spent the day at his parents', but since I was supposed to be spending the weekend with my family, I was making the late drive back over the hills to home. Now, if you don't know about it, Peak to Peak Highway can be a creepy place to be at night. I'm telling you now, if you're an out-of-towner, don't go there. So, you come out of town and start winding through what is basically a very windy road, even though it's built right through and around the mountains. The further you go, the less civilization there is, until you eventually end up on this lonely road, with forest on either side and no real streetlights. So there I am, driving along in my little car, singing along to the radio, when suddenly the radio cuts out, the headlights switch off, and the dashboard now goes black. It was all I could do to stop myself from having a heart attack. Why they decide to not illuminate basically the darkest part of the entire trip is well beyond me. Possibly the county didn't have the money, but I don't know. But, judging by the fact that there was literally nobody else driving the route that night, I guess there really isn't the demand. I was on a fairly straight portion of the road and was able to just kind of let her roll to a stop. If I had been on a bend, and there had been something coming the other way, it could have ended very badly, because I would not have been able to see where I was going, thinking that it must be some sort of electrical problem. I got out of the car, popped the hood. Now, I was no mechanic, but I did have a strong suspicion of what was wrong. It happened once before, and my dad had to show me what to pull and to twist to make the darn thing work again. So, might as well have brought a wrench and beat on the engine to get it to start back up. So, here I am, on my own in front of my own car. I had my cell phone, and I was using that as the only form of light I had. It was pressed between my teeth, and I hear a noise behind me. A noise I don't quite recognize. So, naturally, I freeze. I stopped what I was doing, using the phone like a searchlight, scanning all across the trees. And further up the road, I thought the sound had come from this area, but nothing. Just the darkness and a few leaves moving in the breeze. I told myself it was probably just the wind, and went back to what I was doing. After some more carefully directed pulling and twisting, putting the hood down, as I did, I caught sight of the most terrifying reflection in the windshield. A creature with deep, sunken-in yellow eyes stared out in the dark behind me. So I slammed the door, fumbled the keys into the ignition as quickly as I could. I kept turning and turning it over and over in a desperate attempt to get this thing to work. And eventually, I turned to my right, and I saw what I could only describe as a monster. It looked something like a wolf, or a dog or something, but it appeared to have the body of a man. It was staring into the window of the car, its longer snout opening, and showing its terrible, murderous teeth. I think one of the scariest memories is this didn't have teeth like a dog. They reminded me of a reptile or a shark, just out of place and jagged, and sticking out of its mouth. These teeth did not belong in the mouth of this animal. You know, people have tried to tell me it was a bear, and trust me, I seldom tell this story to anybody. But I know what a bear looks like. Bears are very distinctive looking. The head of this thing was the wrong shape. The whole thing was wrong. Okay, it wasn't a bear. It was some kind of hybrid thing. I know that's crazy, but it looked exactly like a man and a coyote or a wolf. I remember its ears very distinctly, jutting upwards on the top of its head. It looked very canine, nothing like a bear. Finally, I don't know if it was the grace of God or what, but the car burst into life, the headlights flooding. And an instant later, I was hurtling away, leaving behind whatever this animal or predator was behind me, in the darkness, where it belongs. Unfortunately, I'll never get this out of my head. And luckily, we do live in town now. I've never taken that highway since. But that does not take back the countless nightmares I've had of this predator that walks around in the woods at night. And I thought monsters weren't real. And I thought horror stories and horror movies were not based on reality. But this whole thing has made me reevaluate my life. Reevaluate what we really do consider reality. I was driving home from a work event late one night when this huge storm hit. I was out on a small back road, still 20 miles outside of the city. It was pitch black out there, and at this time of night, there was almost zero traffic. The rain was bad enough that I could not see, but then the hail began, and I knew I needed to get somewhere safe. If it were just the rain, I probably could have parked on the side of the road and waited it out, but there was lightning and terrible wind. I was worried about a tree falling on the car with me in it, or getting washed into a ditch, upside down. And my dad was an EMT, and I'd heard lots of horror stories. He made sure I knew how to keep myself safe in any sort of emergency situation. I had a flashlight in my glove box, and I slowed down, looked around outside, trying to spot shelter of any kind. I saw what looked like a barn set back in the woods, just up the road. I decided to try and wait it out, get the storm out of the way. I parked the car, leaving the flashers on so nobody would hit it, then ran for the barn. When I got there, I realized it was not a barn at all, but actually an old abandoned house. It was in rough shape, but it was mostly dry, and the shelter from any storm would have been suffice. Besides, it was in a clearing and made of wood, so it was probably pretty fail-safe from lightning, right? The door was locked, but the window was broken, so I climbed through. There didn't appear to be any glass. I wasn't worried about getting cut. I found a dry spot in a closed stairwell, away from the windows, and sat and waited for the storm to pass. I understand you probably think it's strange that I went out of my way to do this, but I guess maybe you'll understand once I get to the end of the story. I didn't want to be stuck in the creepy house all night. And finally, the wind had died down, and I hadn't seen lightning or had heard thunder in quite a while, so I assumed the worst had passed. I looked outside, and it still appeared to be raining, but not quite as hard as it was. I climbed back out the window, made a run for my car. I was sliding around in the mud and had to keep my eyes on the ground. When I get close to my car, I skidded to a stop, nearly falling. A human figure was standing at my car, by the driver's side, looking in. I could only see the dark shape, but no real discernible details. Between the dark and steady rain, I could not see more than a few feet. After my heart had stopped pounding, I realized that it was probably another concerned driver, or maybe even a police officer. I took a few steps closer, yelling hello, but there was no answer. The shape in my car shifted, and then walked around behind my car. It moved oddly, hunched over, and walking with a bizarre cadence. I still could not see much. I remembered my flashlight, lifting it, pointing the beam at the shape. I can now see this creature clearly, and I lost it. It was a monster, not a human at all. I'd only had a glimpse of this furry face and long teeth before it ran on 2 feet, out of the path of my flashlight. It ran into the woods when my light hit it, so I ran towards my car, fumbling with my keys. I made a wide circle around the car, keeping my eyes on where it had to run to. I was nearly panicking, desperate to get into my car and get out of there. I dropped my keys again, and my hands were so wet. But on the next try, I was successful in opening the car, diving inside and slamming the door shut, locking on the doors. I looked around, making sure this thing that I saw wasn't near, and I pulled out of there as quickly as I could. But that's not all of it. The rain was still coming down very hard, and it forced me to go slower than I wanted to. It was good though, because when something jumped out in front of my car, I would just slide into it. Despite only going about 30 miles an hour, my brakes had skid on the wet road. I put the car in park, jumped out, convinced I'd actually hit something. I ran to the front of the car and looked down. There was nothing there, but in the headlights, I could see a smear of blood. A thick tuft of fur stuck in the grill of my car. My stomach dropping, and I ran back inside the car. As I pulled away a second time, I saw something shining at me, coming from the trees. As I pulled away a second time, I saw something shining at me, coming from the trees. A pair of eyes, glowing eyes, set in a dog-like face. It was the monster I'd just seen, a canine creature running on 2 legs, and I guess I'd hit it with the car. I was so scared I couldn't process it all, and peeled out of there, no longer caring about the rain or what I could have done to my car. By some miracle, I had made it home alive. The next day, when I went out to look at my car, there was an actual dent on the hood, and fur, and the blood on the grill and bumper. I called my father over. When he saw the damage, he'd asked if I'd hit a bear, and I told him no. So I tried to describe the thing that I had hit. He insisted that it was dark and raining hard, and that I'd hit a bear, and just could not see it well. But I'll never forget those glowing eyes, or the sharp teeth and the weirdly human dog face. It's strange how, when I tell people what I saw, they usually backfire with some sort of explanation. Well, it was probably this, or it might have been that. I mean, they all do it. Everybody has a suggestion of what I might have seen or what I probably saw. They never let themselves consider what I saw. It might actually just be what it is that I saw. You know, it makes me laugh, because they say it quickly. Like no sooner have I said the words, and they fire back with these theories that just don't make sense. It's almost like a reflex muscle. They just can't help. Like their brains say, no, this challenges the norm. Everything we know. This can't be true. Those things aren't real. But I saw what I saw. And I saw it as plainly as I see my hand before my face. What I saw was solid. It was there. It was in the physical realm. And made no attempt to explain it away. You're not going to convince me otherwise. Let me kind of tell you now what exactly had happened. I had been at the fairground back in June of 2016. They set up the rides and booths on Markham's fields about twice a year. You always know it's coming because you'll see flyers plastered all over town. Anyway, I always love these local fairs, and in particular, the rides. I don't know about you, but there's something about the fact that a ride wasn't there a week ago, that it's been unloaded from the back of someone's truck, and put together with a screwdriver and a monkey wrench. It really just makes it 10 times scarier than the rides you get at Six Flags or even Disney World. It gives them this added element of danger. That, in addition to the speed and movement of the rides, they might not have been put together that well. Of course, you very rarely ever hear of anyone actually being hurt. If that's true, they'd be shut down, and I'm sure there are all kinds of safety checks. Anyway, last June, like I said, a few friends and I headed down to the fair. After a lot of needling, we managed to convince Donna, whose real name I won't use, but she hates these kind of rides. We got her to go on something called the Kraken. Now, let me explain something. The Kraken is this huge 8-armed contraption. You sit on one carriage with 4 other people. The ride has a total of 8, and each at the end of one of the mechanical arms. They all go lift into the air, and the entire thing spins. There were 4 of us, and only 3 spaces left. I let Donna and the others get into one, so I go into one by myself. I'm partly pleased because the weight of these tend to spin faster and give you a better ride. If you've ever been to any amusement park, you'll probably know what I'm talking about. Once the ride began, just as we were being lifted up into the air, I happened to glance toward the tree line, and I swear I saw something. It appeared to be standing, hunched against one of the trees and watching the crowd. I'd seen nature documentaries where you see wolves or lions standing at the edge of the brush, using the trees as camouflage. That look on their face as they're observing, strategizing, preparing to pounce. This was almost an identical situation. This animal wasn't just watching out of curiosity, but it was planning, selecting, weighing up its next move. It appeared to be, even from the distance I was from it, far bigger than any man or ape that I had ever seen. And judging by the size of the trees, I'd say it was easily between 7 or 8 feet tall. It was standing up on its hind legs, like a person would, but with this sort of backward lean, as if the hips were different than ours. From the glimpses I got, it seemed to be hunched, and it was not a person. I think the best way I could describe it would be some sort of cross between a dog and a man, or the kind of creature you see in horror movie films, like a werewolf, but not exactly a werewolf. It's as if the head was of some massive wolf, and had just been slapped on the shoulders of some large man. It appeared to be covered in this dark, light fur. Different patterns, but you could tell from the way it was built. It seemed very powerful, ready to leap out and grab anybody. I was screaming, but so was everybody else, because of the ride. I began pointing frantically at the trees, trying to get somebody's attention. Either this was the most elaborate prank I'd ever seen, or this was about to get deadly. Soon enough, I was facing away from the tree line, and trying my best against the G-force to turn into my seat, to look back over my shoulder and to see it again. All I saw were quick flashes of it, tiny, snatched glimpses, and by the time the ride was finished, this animal or creature was now gone. I kept scanning the trees to try and see it again, and show it to the other. I tried to explain to them how it looked, how it had canine-like appearances, like a muscular body, and a very dog-like head, but it also appeared to have very human-like features. Anyway, all I got back was quick-fire explanations. They suggested I was hallucinating, making it up, or just happened to see something that really wasn't there. But I tell you what, if werewolves are really existent, then that was the most realistic one I've ever seen. I know what I saw. It did not appear to be a person in a costume either. There's no reason for it. Why would somebody randomly be at the tree line, and that somebody be in an easily $3,000 costume, and to also be around 7 or 8 feet tall? I'll tell you what though, it freaked me out so much that sometimes when I'm alone at night, I still see it. I can't get it out of my head how it's something that just shouldn't exist, but it does. I would love to see if you have any answers on this. This was around May in 2013. I got my first real girlfriend at the age of 17. I'll never forget her name, Caitlin. We had been dating for a few months, off and on, and were at the point where we were always trying to find places to sneak away, for privacy's sake. I mean, both of our parents were pretty strict about not having closed doors, etc. You know how parents are. It forced us to get creative. Eventually, I remembered that there was this old farm next to my aunt's house across town. I had played there a few times as a kid and knew there was an empty barn on the property. I was pretty sure that it wasn't even being used anymore. Just our luck, right? Well, I talked to Caitlin and she was down. One Friday night, we decided to go check it out. We told our parents that we're going out to dinner and a movie, but instead, we got takeout, drove out to my aunt's house, parked down the street, and cut through her yard. I even brought a lantern. Old school, I know, but you use what you can use. I also took a few blankets for a picnic, and possibly other things. My aunt lived at the very edge of town, and her property and the farm door next door were bordered by a decent-sized forest. It was all privated land. I was relieved to see that the barn was still there, and did not look like it was falling down. So, after a few tries, I was able to pry open the door successfully. I turned on the lantern, looking around. Yeah, it was pretty rustic for sure, but at least it was dry, and most importantly, private. It smelled a little musty, but was otherwise fine. We picked a spot in the far corner, set up our blankets, and then our dinner. We had just finished our meal when we had heard a noise. It was a faint scratching sound. We bolted up, looking around. I did not want to tell Caitlin that there were probably rats here in the barn, although that was my best guess. So I told her it was likely stray cats. But when we heard the sound again, it was coming from outside the barn, and it sounded large, very big, not a rat or a cat. So I got up with the lantern, peeked between the gaps in the wood slates. I didn't see anything, so I went back. The third time the scratching came, it appeared right behind us, and much louder. Caitlin screamed and demanded that we leave now. I wasn't ready to give up on our little hideout, so I offered to go outside and look, using my phone flashlight, opening the barn door just enough to slip out. I walked all around the perimeter of the building, but didn't see anything, at least until I actually looked at the walls. There were these huge scratch marks all the way down into the wood, including the corner where we had been sitting at. The marks were very deep, concerning, and most horrifying. They looked fresh. So I ran back into the barn and told Caitlin. We weren't sure what to do. If something was out there, like a bear, we had a long walk out in the open before we got back to anyone's car. But we felt relatively safe here in the barn, since I could always just latch the door. I mean, unless we had a big slab of food, I really don't think any bears were going to be trying breaking in. We tried to figure out what might have made those marks. It was something bigger than a cat, that was for sure. The most likely answer was possibly a stray dog. It had smelt our dinner, and probably just wanted some. But in this part of Indiana, we also had bobcats. That was always a possibility. So we waited a few minutes to see if we could hear the animal again. We decided if we didn't hear anything for more than 5 minutes, we would make a run for it. At 4.5 minutes, something began banging against the door. We both screamed, and then it rattled, then moved around the building, testing the walls. At that point, we were scared enough to call for help, even if that meant getting grounded for sneaking out there. Caitlin suggested her older brother. He would not tell her parents, and he was home from college for the weekend to do errands and laundry. She asked him to bring a weapon, gave him directions. Although it would take him a good 20 minutes just to get out to us, though. Was it worth it? We climbed up top a built-in cabinet and stayed put and quiet, hoping this animal would eventually go away. There was a small hole in the wood near us, and so I pressed my eye to it, watching, looking around to see if I can see anything. Up on the cabinet, I was nearly about 7 feet off the ground, so when an eyeball looked back at me, I just about had a heart attack. I scrambled, freaked out, nearly falling. The eye looked orangish and yellowish, like an animal. I freaked out, yelling nonsense at Caitlin, who was now crying. I understand that this part of the story probably sounds ridiculous, and I get that. But I can't take back the fear that I felt. So I grab her, pull her to the other side of the barn, inside a much older horse stall. I tried to explain to her what I had seen, but she just could not understand. She looked half like she didn't believe me, half petrified because of the look on my face. We stood in the corner, huddled together. There was a small gap between the boards on the outer wall there, too. I stayed away from it, having learned my lesson, but kept glancing at it. Sure enough, I soon saw a shape moving past the gap. It appeared tall, but was confirming that it was indeed the source of whatever eye I had seen, and it appeared to be looking for us. I had no idea how it could be so tall. I mean, not even a human could be that tall. I was sure the eye wasn't human, but maybe I was wrong. On the next pass, I see a flash of hair, and I knew I was right. Maybe it was a bear on its hind legs, and it somehow smelled food. I mean, I'm positive it wasn't human. So I leaned forward a little, despite Caitlin's trying to pull me back. And just in that moment, this hairy hand reaches through the gap, curling its long claws right around the wood, making every attempt possible to pull it off. That's when everything went haywire. We run out of the stall, standing in the middle of the barn, trying not to hyperventilate and pass out from sheer terror. Luckily, just then, we heard her brother calling for us. So we run towards the door, flung it open, knocking right into him. He was holding a baseball bat and looking very confused. I was about to tell him he needed to run when we all heard the growling sound. There, by the barn, appeared to be this animal, or our stalker. The tallest animal I've ever seen, and it was standing on 2 legs. Its face was like that of a dog, kind of like a Doberman Pinscher, actually. Very sharp teeth, kind of orangey amber eyes, and it was staring at us, slowly backing and forth between us. It looked incredibly strong, full of muscles, and I was mesmerized, half in awe, half in complete terror at what I was looking at. It reminded me of if you took half demon, half man, and then splashed some dog features in there. But I don't know. Then, it raised its head into the air and began sniffing all around, but mainly in the direction of the forest. At the same time, Caitlin's brother hit us both in the back and yells at us to run. We all sprinted for the car, taking a chance and not looking back. Caitlin leaves with her brother, and I speed home faster than I've ever driven on those back roads, which is incredibly dangerous due to how curvy they are, and you gotta watch out for deer. But I don't think any of us cared at this point in time. Our survival instinct was clearly maxed out. So the next day, Caitlin decided to break up with me, and we can never tell anybody why. I've endured some pretty wild experiences while I lived with my father just outside of Waco, Texas, from the age of 15 to 20. Man, I got so many stories I could share with you, so I'll start with one. This would have been in the summertime of 2013. My father was busy setting up his gun range of the far back side of the house. He had a bunch of old tires he was building a gun wall and setting up a really nice range. During this, he said he felt a strange feeling. A feeling of imminent danger, like he shouldn't be there. He thought the entire thing was strange and fought off his gut instinct as much as possible. After all, this was our property. We've had no problems with intruders ever before. And now this? So, ignoring it and quelching any emotion, my father continued pulling old tires out of the back of the pickup, setting up the gun range, and he sees this figure, a blur, go right by him. He quickly turns in reaction and sees this large green figure on all fours, off in the trees. And as soon as he laid eyes on it, it looks over at him, and they make direct eye contact. He said that he felt that this thing was intelligent, just by looking at it. It wasn't just some giant oversized lizard. It was of incredible size anyway, though, and so he quickly put his hand on his Glock and got ready, just in case this thing decided to make a move and act aggressive. And as soon as my father put his hand on his Glock, and this thing watching him the entire time, grabs hold of the nearby tree and stands up on 2 legs. It grabbed hold of the tree, like it needed the support to pull itself up, which my dad always noted it was very strange to see that. From there, it appeared as if the stare down between my father and this thing deepened in intensity. This thing slowly opened its mouth, revealing a loud but deep guttural hiss. And it was in that moment that my father felt imminent fear and danger. So he readied his pistol, taking aim, but not firing yet. But he felt that this thing was getting ready to attack. Just by the look in its eyes, he told me, "Son, when you see this specific look in a wild animal's eyes, you just know they're getting ready to attack. And that's exactly what he claims he saw. So he pulls back the hammer, and this thing immediately begins charging at him on two legs, with its arms outstretched and kind of dangling. He fires 3 quick shots. Bam, bam, bam! And whatever this thing was, immediately stops, drops down to all fours, turns to the side, and bolts off, heading for the tree line, and quickly disappears into the brush. It was large, so as it was going through the trees and brush, it was making this terrible loud crashing sound, traversing off deeper into the backwoods. It about scared my pop half to death. I mean, even to this day, we have no idea what he saw, and he's told the story to me countless times. I wasn't there for that one. But before I move on to the next encounter, let me give you a little bit better geography on that encounter. So where he was setting up his gun range at with the tires and target practices, there's a few trees loosely spread out, and an actual tree line, maybe 60 or 70 yards away, completely visible from where he's at. When he first was alerted to movement, this thing, he said, was much closer to him, and somehow managed to run by him, eluding him, hiding in the trees. When he went to look, this thing was already behind a tree, getting ready to watch him or do something. He said that its entire demeanor was very suspicious. It was acting shady, like it was not only trying not to get caught, but that it was up to something, and mentioned that this thing did not like it that my dad spotted it, because its entire expression changed once they made eye contact, like it was telling my father, "You're not supposed to see me." That was back when I was probably around 15 or 16. I wasn't there for that, but my father has told me that many times. The next encounter would be when I was about 18. I was just finishing my senior year of high school, and I was home with my dad one evening, digging holes in the back. After a little bit, my father went inside for something. I can't remember what, so it was just me out there alone. The house is maybe roughly 100 feet in front of me, directly in front of me. I'm surrounded on my right, left, and behind of woods. So there I go again, digging, completely ignoring. And then I notice everything around me goes completely silent. But looking back, it was the eeriness of the whole thing that I picked up on. And then I just continued on digging, because I thought it was strange, but just thought, whatever. So I kept digging, ignoring the strange now silence. That's when I kept hearing rustling all around me. It sounded like some big animal was moving just beyond eyesight, off in the trees. I would occasionally glance over to see if there was anything, thinking it might be a bear or maybe a cow, since there are ranches around here, and sometimes cows tend to get lost sometimes. But it didn't sound like that. It sounded more like a really big person, trying to be quiet, sneaking through the trees. My dad owns a lot of acres and trees back here, so I can't think of any reason why there would be anybody back here. The terrain isn't exactly the nicest, and there's nothing out here to get, steal, or have any interest in, period. Plus, it's all backcountry, so there's really nothing of interest out here. As I'm sitting there digging, and I'm thinking all of these things, it's all running through my mind, and I'm trying to process what's going on, and my father still has not returned. I begin to feel like something was watching me, very closely. Not just watching me, but intently watching me, like they were making a maniacal plan to do something to me. I got really creeped out, stopped what I was doing, and just thought, you know what, it's not worth it. I'll just walk back to the house, tell my father, and I'm sure it'll be fine. And that's exactly what I did. So, as I get back to about maybe 20 feet away from the house, I hear what sounds like a mix between a low guttural growl, kind of like a lion would make, and a very deep hiss. If I could describe it to you in terms of animal noises, I guess combine a lion with a Komodo dragon maybe, and you have that same kind of growl hiss quality. That's kind of what it sounded like. But here's the issue. Since the trees run far behind me, all the way to the side of the house in front of me, I never heard it once walk parallel with me from where I was at digging that hole all the way to about roughly 20 feet away from my back door. And what that means is by the time I heard that noise, it had walked parallel with me to keep up with me, because that noise was just off to my left, maybe no more than 50 feet, because the tree line isn't straight. It kind of curves and weaves in and out. And at this spot, it was really maybe 50 feet away from me at most. So whatever was there was right in the trees, tucked away just enough that I could not see it. But it was certainly keeping tabs on me. I was done for the day at that point. My walking quickly turned into a sprint. I ripped open the back door, told my father what had happened. Luckily, he took my concern very seriously and just told me to keep a weapon. Now, during this time, I did not think at all that this was the same unknown animal he encountered a couple years back. This was just its own isolated, terrifying incident. As the year would progress on, we never saw it, but we definitely felt the strange feelings of being watched, like there's just something off in the tree line that we can't quite discern, or the weird sounds, this weird, strange, raspy breathing that we can't quite place. My dad likes to think it was a hog, but it sounded different than a hog. And then, finally, in the following year, now I'm about 19, and we go fishing. It's about September or October. It was still warm out, and hadn't yet reached the cool point in fall, so probably early October would be my best guess. There's a small creek, about 5 or so miles away from our house. My dad and I love to go fishing, recreationally. We're not professional at it, but it's something we love to do to go for an off-time outing event. So we get to this creek, the same creek we've been going to for years. And right as we get to our spot, the same spot we've been going to for years and have had no prior issues, we smell this terrible odor. I can't even begin to describe it. It was kind of a rotten smell, but it had a unique smell profile to it. I wish I could describe it to you. It just smelled like dirty, rotten death, but there was an underlying stink that I just can't put my finger on. It was really thick in the air. No, it wasn't a musty odor, or anything that people think or smell with Bigfoot. I've had an encounter with Bigfoot myself, but I'll get to that in probably a separate email. This smelled entirely different. Imagine maybe leaving a goat carcass out in the hot sun for a few days, and then adding hot garbage around that, and then adding an extra layer of earthy dirtiness to it. That's kind of what it reminded me of. Stinky bog death. My father and I make a comment about how strange the odor is, but quickly get to fishing, and just try to ignore it the best we can. After maybe 20 minutes, the smell seems to be intensifying and not dying down. My dad mentions there might be a carcass somewhere close by, which could be the cause of the smell. So we decide that maybe we should go looking for it, or change spots entirely, just to see which direction we should go. Right when that happened, both my father and I's attention is turned across the creek to this large opening or a clearing in the brush, where this, what I can only describe to you as a reptile man, steps out and walks directly towards us, on 2 legs, 2 feet, mind you, the same as a human being. It looked very gaunt, very frail, but also lean and muscular at the same time. The expression on its face was that of anger, and it was walking directly at us. But one thing I'll never forget, besides how scary it was the sheer intensity in its eyes, like it wanted to hurt us. It was going to, had it gotten the chance to. My dad, quickly reacting, pulled out his Glock, fired a few shots at this thing, and it screamed and let out this terrible noise that I've never heard from an animal ever in my life. We threw down our fishing equipment and just ran towards the vehicle, something my father has always been very adamant about never doing. Never run from an unknown predator. But this was something else entirely different. We don't even know what this was. We didn't look back either to see if this thing continued its pursuit. We made it back, about a quarter of a mile back to the truck, and we got out of there pretty quickly. We did come back to the creek the next day for our fishing equipment, which was still there. again, because this was kind of backcountry. Not that many people go to this creek, unless you're local. And at that point, we all pretty much know each other anyway. So didn't have to worry about anybody stealing our stuff, which is nice. But this funky creature, it was weird looking, man. It kind of had a very elongated head. Think of maybe like an iguana or some large lizard. And its body was very skinny, but still very lean. It was a strange dark and pale green that kind of interchanged. I could see some faint muscles on its stomach, chest, and legs, but that was about it. And it seemed to have a tail. But it all happened so fast, we watched it for maybe a few seconds as it walked towards us, and didn't waste any time. And after we shot at it, we heard it scream, but never looked to see if it was chasing us, which I'm sure it did. And maybe we encountered its territory, or got close to its den. I don't know. One thing I know is that we've never smelled that stink before. And since all these happenings, we had since gone to that creek to fish or just to hang out. And as a matter of fact, the last time we visited this fishing spot was probably back in June or May. So, really, I don't know what you want to title this. I guess you can call it the Backwoods Texas Lizard Man. But whatever it is, I'm glad I haven't seen it since. After I hit about 20 years old, I moved away to a friend's, and we've been roommating for a while, before I finally found a good career to go on to. That involves being in a little more civilized area, with more buildings, not so much backwoods. Do I miss the backwoods? Yeah. Do I miss seeing that thing? Not so much. Firstly, let me say that I'm an educated man who works in the medical field at our trauma hospital here in Montana. The other witness is a deputy sheriff. Both of us are in our mid-30s, married and have children. Neither of us, however, drink, use drugs, or in any way were incapacitated during the time of this sighting. I would also be relevant to tell you that I grew up in Washington State, where I spent countless summers camping, hiking, and enjoying the outdoors. My good friend grew up in Oregon and spent a great deal of time hunting, camping, and recreating in the outdoors. We both now live in Missoula, Montana, and have never heard the sounds like we did last night, on January 23rd, 2005. My buddy and I returned from our coffee at Barnes & Noble. He was dropping me off in my driveway, near around 9 p.m. The moon was pretty full last night, and it was cloudless, so visibility was great. Behind my new home, which sits on nearly 2 acres, is a large hill that descends on the other side to a partially wooded area in a canyon where deer are seen just about all the time. The heavier, more dense forest starts less than a mile away, and in fact heads into the mountains. As we conversed in my driveway, the complete silence was broken. This silence was broken by this god-awful howl, growl, or moaning that echoed throughout the entire valley. The volume was overwhelming, and immediately, my dog, as well as multiple dogs on the road, began barking and almost seemingly panicked. Now, please, let me tell you that we got elk, deer, bear, and mountain lion around here pretty consistently, but never any reaction from the dogs, not like this. We went behind my house, where my dog was no longer barking, but instead, just shivering, and now looking up at the hill, just as it did it again. The sound is so incredibly similar to the howl you have. A third series of growls, and let me tell you, they were deep and extremely loud, soared across our neighborhood. I let my dog have refuge in his fenced-in kennel, where he retreated to his doghouse. My dog is a year-old lab who has grown up exposed to many wild animals. We waited, but the noise finally stopped after a minute to 2 minutes. We both commented on how the hair on the back of our necks were sticking up, and that neither of us had heard anything like that before in all of our years. My friend left, and I headed into the house, where I felt compelled to load hollow point slugs into my shotgun, and for nearly 30 minutes, I noticed my dog staring up on the hill, but did not hear another noise for the remainder of the night. There's only one other witness outside, and my wife inside, almost reluctant to talk to the other neighbors, but would probably do so. A follow-up investigation report was filed and reads as follows. I contacted the witness within 1 week of the incident and discussed it at length on the phone. I followed up with the on-location visit and interview at the witness's home in Missoula. I found the witness to be absolutely credible, an educated man in the medical field, with personal law enforcement experience as well. As stated in the initial report, the witness has had extensive experience in the outdoors and is very familiar with all local wildlife. In fact, he recalled actually witnessing a grizzly bear take down a calf elk in Glacier National Park, which is a very rare occurrence. The witness accurately related the incident to me in person. He again described the vocalization as the most intense sound he's ever heard. It echoed throughout the entirety of the neighborhood and incited a terrible response from nearly all the dogs in the area. To provide an example of the volume of the sound, the witness's wife, who was in the house with all doors and windows shut, heard it, came out to ask what was going on. The tone of the vocalization was not a scream. It was too deep and bassy, and according to the witness, it sounded pissed off and mad. There were a total of 3 of these growl-like howls, which ended after approximately 2 minutes. The witness discussed the level of fear he felt at the time, which he described as unusual, given his experience as a sheriff's deputy. As stated, he was compelled to load slugs into his shotgun. The night was clear with the hill being illuminated by the light of the moon. One might ask how the witness did not see the source of the vocalization. I discovered it possible upon personally climbing to the top of the hill, to stand on the summit and view the majority of the subdivision without being discernible from the homes directly below the ridge. The witness did not notice any unusual odor during the incident either. The witness's dog, which I encountered on the visit to Missoula, is a rambunctious young lab, just seemingly oblivious to just about anything. It seems significant to me that the dog just sat staring towards the top of the hill during the entirety of the incident, shivering and whining, and ultimately retreating to the safety of its doghouse. Following the incident, the witness began browsing the internet in search of explanations for this uncanny sound. Coming across the BFRO site, he explained to me that the Ohio howl seemed very similar to the sound he heard that night. However, the sounds he heard sounded much more aggressive, intense, and angrier. The terrain surrounding this location is very interesting. The subdivision in which the witness lives is a single street, with homes on both sides running approximately 1 mile parallel with an incredibly steep ridge. The ridge, approximately 350 feet above the street, is bare, covered only in long grass, and the subdivision sits in its shadow in the flat valley below. The ridge, located a mere 25 yards from the back steps of the witness's house, is so steep that it would be nearly impossible to climb straight up. So, one must switch back to reach the summit. The top of the ridge is essentially a plateau, with a very gradual downward slope to the southwest. There is a line of massive steel power poles running the length of the ridge, continuing to the forested mountains directly to the east. One could walk along the line of power poles directly into the nearby forested mountains, about 1 or so miles to the east. An unusual aspect to the hilltop is to its lack of ground cover. One small ravine draining to the southwest contains a handful of pine trees, but the remainder of the hilltop was completely barren of trees and brush. It is the honest opinion of this investigator that the witness did in fact hear an intensely powerful vocalization, and it is extremely unlikely that this sound emanated from any other known animal or source. In mid-July of 2004, I was on my back porch. It faces east, and it faces a mountain that I live in the woods on the side of my house, where the creature was. The house is scarcely wooded, and the land flat. The sun was shining. The reason I went outside is this. My dogs began to bark and run through the house. They got halfway through, and stopped and whined. I thought that was odd, so I went and sat on the back porch. Then, I saw the tree to my left move, and the tree was about 300 yards away, from me, or less. I'm not the greatest with measurements. So, I watched the tree to see what caught my eye. Then I see this creature. It was behind the tree, looking out from behind it. Its head was in the branches, and it was hunching down. Its head was large, and it had a definite brow ridge. I thought I was seeing an orangutan, except it was about 6.5 feet tall. It was moving its head all around the tree to watch me as I stood up to get a better look. Its hair was even a rusty color, like the color of dead pine needles. Its eyes, though, they were haunting, and it was completely silent. It was watching me while I was watching it, so I sat back down. I watched outside for about 6 minutes and did not tell the person on the phone. Then, I went in the house, watched through the window to make sure it wasn't a trick of shadow. Then, the creature moved in front of the tree, staying hunched over, but watching me in the window. I watched a few more minutes, and then went back to the house. When I went back, it was gone. While this was going on, my kids were in the front, playing with water. I think if this creature had been aggressive, it would have made some sort of move. But I deemed it peaceful. At least it seemed that way. It also seemed to be curious. I think it was young, especially to be in such a vulnerable open area. When my husband came home, we went out to the tree, and all the knapweed was completely trampled down under the tree. We didn't find any hair, though. I look every day to see if it's out there again, but to no avail. They had been barking all morning. Before, but that isn't unusual. The weird thing is that they stopped, short and whined. That is very unusual for them. There was a follow-up investigation report filed, and this is what was said. I interviewed the witness directly over the phone, some 9 months after the incident. She recounted the particulars of the event clearly and accurately in accordance with the details of her initial report. I found the witness to be genuine in her discussing of the incident, and believe her to be quite credible. The incident began at approximately 4 p.m. in July of 2004, when her dogs began barking excitedly from inside the house. The witness actually recalls that she was talking to her sister-in-law on the phone as this all began. The dogs ran through the kitchen to exit the house to the backyard via the doggy door. However, upon reaching the dog door, the dogs both stopped suddenly, and the normally aggressive larger dog began to whine. The witness considered this very abnormal for this particular dog. Out of curiosity, the witness stepped outside to see what might be affecting her dogs in this manner. It was a bright sunny afternoon. After scanning the area, the witness described something catching her eye. Upon returning to her gaze to that location, she then saw an animal that she can only compare to an orangutan at approximately 200 to 300 yards away. It was standing on 2 legs, bipedally, but hunched over, as if trying its best to remain hidden, slightly behind a tree. The animal in question was swaying from left to right, as if to see around the tree, seemingly curious about the witness. She describes the animal as completely covered in hair the color of red pine needles. The witness also described the style of hair, that of a golden retriever, wavy and flowing. She estimates the height of the animal at 7 to 8 feet tall, but cannot accurately estimate because the animal was maintaining a hunched posture. Later that day, the witness asked her husband, who is 6 feet tall, to stand in that same position. She claimed the animal, while hunched over, was easily taller than her own husband. She also describes the mass of the animal as very thick. The witness described the eyes as an amber color. They were deep, very set in the face, with a forward brow. She claimed the head to be very large and round. After the incident, she searched the internet for explanations for this event and found the BFRO site. She claims the animal she saw strongly resembles the Gigantopithecus model displayed in a photograph on the BFRO website. The witness also mentioned that there was not a hair around the eye, nor on the brow of the face. The incident continued while the witness stayed on the phone with her sister-in-law. She did not mention anything about what was happening to this person. The witness was indeed stunned by what she was saying, and most likely was not listening to much of the other end of the phone. This particular sighting lasted maybe 5 to 6 minutes. At no time did the witness experience any sense of fear, nor did she notice any unusual odors. At this point, the witness walked to the front of the house to check on the children, who were subsequently playing in an inflatable swimming pool. After checking the children, the witness returned to the backyard and found the animal had departed. After getting off the phone with her then sister-in-law, she called her husband immediately to discuss the experience. He returned to the home shortly thereafter, and they both went to the tree from which the animal was standing behind. It was obvious, based upon the flattened grass and knapweed, that something large had been standing in that exact location. In the 9 months that have passed since this event, the witness and her family have had no other similar sightings to report. When asked about any unusual sounds in the area, the witness did describe one such event. She described a scream they heard in the spring of 2004. It sounded garbled and reminded her of a young mountain lion screaming. However, the sound emanated from a significant distance, the capacity of which is not normally suggestive of a mountain lion. It has been a while since this incident happened, in 1989, but I remember it well. The incident occurred during the summer of '89. I was working in my father's woodshop when my older brother, who was 19 at the time, burst through the door. He was nearly out of breath and very distraught looking. He immediately demanded that I come outside right now. I asked him what was wrong, but he just said, "Come out here now, quick." I hurriedly followed him outside. It was late afternoon, and the sun was just beginning to wane in the deeper parts of the forest. I asked him what was the matter. He told me to shush, and just said, "Listen." I could hear that our grandparents' dog was going berserk, and I could also recognize the bark of our dog in the distance as well. I asked my brother what was going on with the dogs, and if they were fighting again. He said, "Shh, not the dogs, listen." We were both silent, but I didn't hear anything. I asked him what I was supposed to be listening for. He said he heard something really weird, really freaky. I asked him what it sounded like. He said he couldn't really explain it, that it just sounded weird. I told him that maybe he heard a mountain lion, as I had heard them on several occasions. They make a really strange sound, like an inhuman woman screaming bloody murder. He said it didn't sound like a scream, though. He took off running down the road, towards our grandparents' house, calling for me to follow. I ran after him. Halfway to our grandparents' house, I heard the sound. We both stopped in our tracks. I yelled to him, "What was that?" And he excitedly replied, "That's the sound I heard. That's it." I heard a lot of strange sounds growing up in the deep woods over the years. Elk mating calls, grouse beating their wings, coyotes, etc. But never anything like this. I can't really describe the sound, except that it was a high-pitched tone from a living thing. It was very resonant, powerful, and well-controlled in its execution. It made the hair stand up on the back of my neck. Soon, whatever it was out there in the woods ahead of us made the sound again. This time, for a much shorter duration, and slightly broken. Another period of silence, other than the dogs going nuts. We continued running towards our grandparents' house. We soon arrived where the dogs were. Our dog was standing next to our grandparents' dog, which was tied up. They were both looking and barking into the forest, in the direction we had heard the sound coming from. I had never seen them bark like this, not even at bears. All of a sudden, we heard a similar sound come from a completely different direction on the woods of the opposite side of us. Immediately, the call was answered by another loud report, where we originally heard the first sound. Whatever was out there seemed to be two of them, and they seemed to be communicating. So we continued to listen. Nothing for a minute or two. Then we heard two more distinct calls, this time from the same general direction in the woods, yet separated. They were now coming from a farther distance. Again, they seemed to be replying or communicating with one another. We still continued to listen for several more minutes, but the sounds did not occur again. We told our family members about it, but nobody really paid much attention, as they had not heard the sounds, and since we lived right in the middle of an area used by bears and other animals to travel through the wilderness regularly. The tribe caught 7 bears in one summer, using live bear traps near our house. They probably assumed it was just a normal animal, out in the woods. In any case, I have never forgotten the incident, and often think of the surreal event every time I go back to the wilderness. Oh, I did not mention this, but I did have another experience with a close friend the following year, in 1990, involving what we believed were Bigfoot tracks. When we told her about the incident, my friend's grandmother, who was in her late 80s and had lived in the location where we saw the tracks her whole life, she relayed a story about how she and her husband had seen a Sasquatch in that area over 20 years ago.